Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, and we're going to talk about Strixhaven, and we're going to talk about Amanda Hamon, and an accomplishment that, in my humble opinion, Amanda Hamon has completed, which is becoming Dungeons & Dragons' second recursive designer. All right, so let's get into this because I'm going to need to define some terms for you. All right, so Strixhaven comes out. It is the most important book in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition history outside of the core three, right? So Mike Merle's, the 2014 Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, Mike Merle's PHB, DMG, MM are critically important, and they are even more important than Strixhaven. And the reason why was legit. 4th edition was so dramatically divisive for the Dungeons & Dragons community that it legitimately presented a world in which Dungeons & Dragons could have been swept aside by Paizo if Paizo had driven harder and executed more, right? And actually even understood the arena that the battle they were in was actually occurring in, right? But they didn't, thank goodness. So Pathfinder has been, kind of swept into the dustbin of history, in my humble opinion. And Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, it remains dominant over not only Pathfinder 1E, but the very real attempt to claw to the top the Pathfinder 2E. And there was nothing wrong with them trying to attempt to surpass Dungeons & Dragons. I would definitely not be happy to see Pathfinder ever surpass Dungeons & Dragons because it only has one pillar. I think it only understands the pillar of combat, right? So, all right. So you have this. So Amanda Hamon has become, in my humble opinion, the second recursive designer. Let's talk about that. Okay. All right. So what is a recursive designer? Well, there's only been two, right? Amanda Hamon is in a new group of tabletop role-playing game designers currently, right? And there's only two. So there's these two recursive designers, and then there are game designers. There are Dungeons & Dragons designers. So there's the recursive designers, Gary Gygax and Amanda Hamon, and then there's every other designer, which would be like Mike Merles and Matthew Mercer, right? And Jonathan Tweet and Robert Hainsue, right? They're just regular Dungeons & Dragons designers. They don't get into this special group, which is Gary Gygax and Amanda Hamon. So let's talk about recursive design, okay? So what is recursion? Recursion is when a thing defines itself. Recursion is when a thing defines it is defined. Recursion is when a thing is defined by itself or its own type, okay? And that's exactly what Gary Gygax did and what Amanda Hamon have done. They're the only two Dungeons & Dragons designers in history since 1974 to 2021. They're the only designers that have reached the level of recursive design and have accomplished recursive design. So let's talk about it. All right. So basically, Gary Gygax did recursive design in 1974 and continued recursive design, in my humble opinion, until 1986 when he left TSR, okay? And so what did he do, right? So what he did was he created something that clearly resembled and functioned as a game, right? And to this day, there are still people who think that Dungeons & Dragons are a game and disagree with my opinion, that Dungeons & Dragons is a culture, as is exactly what Professor Dungeon Master said, a culture that you would buy into, or a life path, or a human improvement engine, right? It's fundamentally, in my humble opinion, Dungeons & Dragons is fundamentally not a game. That is only accepted by people who look at Dungeons & Dragons and look at the surface and do not, and very carefully prevent themselves from looking deeper because they don't want to look into the mirror that is Dungeons & Dragons, because if you look deeply at Dungeons & Dragons, you'll change. You will fundamentally change. You will not remain the same person, right, that you are, right? So you have, so Gary Gygax in 1974 to 1986. In 1974, he introduces Unbound Identity and Unbound Immersion, okay? Which I've talked about at length, right? And basically by doing this, he's saying, okay, this functions as a game, but the reality is, I'm doing recursion here. I'm pointing this entire structure back into itself, and there's a structure within the structure. There's a riddle in the middle, right? And there's two ways to play. There's the surface level. I see what I'm told to see, right? And then there's going to be, and Gary knew this, in my humble opinion, knew that in a group of people who were attracted to having multiple lives, there would be this second group of people who looked very deeply at what he was doing and would solve the riddle, right? And the riddle was unbound identity and unbound immersion, right? So you have Gary Gygax. He does recursive design. He's the first to do recursive design, and he did it in the game's creation, right? Amanda Hamon then comes. She sees everything that everybody's done, and she creates Strixhaven. And she, in my humble opinion, when she created Strixhaven, what she did was she said, okay, I see where you're at, right? I see what Gary accomplished. I can't just be like Matt Mercer and go, I'm going to make a setting. Here's a Dungeons & Dragons setting. Here's the surface material, right? And you're not going to find anything hidden in Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, right? It is what it is, right? But Amanda Hamon, because she doesn't spend half her time as a voice actor, right, and it has thought incredibly deeply about Gary Gygax, the history of Dungeons & Dragons, and has created actual tabletop role-playing games, successful products outside of Wizards of the Coast, and then was graduated to Wizards of the Coast, made a game designer. Amanda Hamon gets there and she goes, I'm not going to spend my time doing what Chris Perkins does. I need to surpass him, right? And she did, right? So what she did is she takes Strixhaven, right? And she says, okay, Swolequip, Silverquill, Witherbloom, Lorehold, Quandrix, Prismari, right? I'm going to celebrate the core ingredient, the key elements of Dungeons & Dragons that Gary Gygax set in place. Writing, biology, history, math, art, right? I will make Strixhaven a conceptual map of the game itself, so that unknowing players playing Strixhaven, right, they think they're playing in a magical school within Dungeons & Dragons. But the more advanced players, the players who see the riddle in the middle and get the solution, not just see the riddle, but have the solution, say, oh my gosh, she built a conceptual map of Dungeons & Dragons. And as we explore Strixhaven, we're exploring what it means to be a dungeon master, what it means to transition from player to dungeon master, and connecting back to the original recursion. Gary's recursion was the combat recursion, okay? Amanda Hamon has created the social interaction has unlocked the social interaction pillar. It did not exist before Strixhaven. There were 3 identified pillars in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It was set into place and not named. Set into place and unnamed. Okay? All 3 pillars were created by Gary Gygax in 1974. Okay? Mike Mearls named them, identified them, the same way Adam named the animals, right? So now they were named in 2014. Combat, social interaction, exploration, right? The combat pillar for between 1974 to 2014, exactly 40 years, right, existed and was built out, right? And we had high mechanical complexity. That pillar existed. The social interaction pillar and the exploration pillar were purely performative. They were not actually accomplished, right? So basically, Amanda Hamon comes in my humble opinion, she creates and unlocks and makes real the social interaction pillar. Today, we are only performatively gesturing at the exploration pillar. There will need to be a 3rd recursive designer that will unlock the exploration pillar. And we don't even know what that will look like. We don't really even know what that will look like. And it is going to take at least, in my opinion, 20 20 years before we'll get to the exploration pillar. Why? Because this world absolutely detests anyone who looks below the surface. I'm very aware of this right now. If you take the time to look below the surface and say there is more here than others are seeing, you will have a swift and very direct pushback, right? And so our world doesn't allow change, right? It fears it and it punishes it, right? And so Amanda Hamon needed to, it took 40 years to move past the combat pillar, right? And social interaction was really only identified in 2014, and it was unlocked in 2021 by Amanda Hamon. So it's really fascinating. And so Amanda Hamon, in my humble opinion, is the second recursive designer, and is building out this group of critical, higher level designers within Dungeons and Dragons. Right? There's Gary Gygax and there's Amanda Hamon, and Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford and Matthew Mercer. They're not playing at her level, right? And the reason why is she's the only designer in D&D's history to reach that higher key level that Gary started the entire game with, right? He was a preeminent recursive designer from the beginning. And now the second recursive designer has arrived, and the only question is who will engage. So all that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.